do. All right, so for part 2 of the activity, you should have already copied and pasted the link into your own individual document. So just expand on the main points as I lecture. So really what we're trying to do with a cultural competence point of view with relation to intersectionality is to really think about some of the differences that exist culturally that may lead to conflict, right? And how do we become more culturally aware so that we don't reduce each other to stereotypes, but allow for a greater understanding of difference and openness to how we're communicating. So cultural competence then is about having cultural self-awareness, right? Which is kind of what you did in part 1, is really develop who you are and understanding of where you're coming from. Cultural competence is also about having a non-evaluative perception about others because you don't want to judge people before you even get to know them. It's also about being adaptive, like having some cultural adaptation strategies to really figure out where people are coming from, right? And being adapted to that. And then finally, having some kind of cross-cultural competency, or sorry, cross-cultural empathy, which is another way of saying, you know, you want to understand people who are culturally different than you. And so I think each of these components really helps you figure out, well, where do you fit on these cultural, I guess you would call them either like differences or continuums. And then when you're in conversation with others, why might there be some kind of conflict or breakdown? It might be because of this like cultural difference that you're having. So these dimensions really help us to understand who we are, and then understand others so that we don't end up being judgmental or offended or misunderstood. We can work ourselves out of these issues, especially if they're along these sort of cultural competence issues. So the first kind of continuum is known as power distance. So power distance. So this dimension expresses the degree to which the less powerful members of society accept and expect the power as distributed unequally. So really what's going on with power distance is how does a culture handle inequality among people? So the extreme would be like, you know, a society would be open to a large amount of inequality versus a cultural understanding where like very little inequality is accepted. So power distance again is about really understanding how a culture handles inequality among people. So people in societies exhibiting a large degree of power distance will accept a hierarchical order in which everybody has a place and it doesn't need any justification. There's just a difference and there's a power difference, right? And that's how culturally they've understood this power. In cultures with low power distance, people strive to equalize the distribution of power and demand justification for inequalities of power. So not only do you have kind of like a flattened understanding of power distribution, but you also have an ideology that really tries to explain why do people experience things differently, especially along power. So if you're having a conversation about inequality, it's probably really important to identify where you are with power distance. Do you accept a hierarchy, right? And is that okay with you and that everybody has their place and that's it? Or are you more on the other end of the spectrum where you want to minimize power differential? And then in terms of who you're talking to, where do you think they're coming from? So that's a one dimension of cultural competence. The second dimension of cultural competence is collectivism versus individualism. The high side of this dimension, we'll start with individualism, prefers a loosely knit social framework in which individuals are expected to take care of themselves and their immediate families. So it's very much about self-interest, you and your family, that's it, and maybe your close friends. The opposite end of this dimension, collectivism, represents a preference for a tightly knit framework in society in which individuals expect to look not only about for themselves, but for others as well. So this is where culturally we either see ourselves as an I or a we, right? So individualism is more about self-interest, and your self-identity, your self-image is defined by yourself and you alone, versus more of a we kind of self image, where you understand that you're responsible not only for yourself, but for others. So thinking about cultural differences and why we have conflict, a lot of it can stem towards this orientation. For example, like the debate over wearing a mask, right? So it's really about this cultural competence and awareness about people's self-image. Is it just about me protecting my own health, or do we understand health as like a public health issue? Third dimension of cultural competence is femininity versus masculinity. And the masculinity side of this dimension represents a preference for achievement, assertiveness, heroism, and material rewards for success. So again, the masculinity side of this dimension has a cultural preference for achievement, heroism, assertiveness, and material rewards for success. This is a society or culture that's very competitive. The opposite, femininity, is a cultural preference for cooperation, modesty, caring for the weak, and the quality of life. In this culture, it's more consensus oriented rather than competitive, right? So how do we work together? So again, I think cultural competence will really tell you why there is conflict around whether or not we value competition, material rewards, assertiveness, versus do we value more cooperation, caring for each other, especially the weak, and then a consensus-oriented way of making decisions. The next dimension is the uncertainty avoidance, or weak to strong dimension. And this expresses the degree to which members of a society feel uncomfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. So on the uncertainty avoidance dimension, again, looking at whether or not we are culturally comfortable or uncomfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. So here the issue is like, how do we deal with the future, right? The future can never really be known. Do we try to control it or just let it happen? So cultures that exhibit a strong uncertainty avoidance index, or UAI, will maintain rigid codes of belief and behavior, and they're very intolerant to any kind of change. So to control the future, right, to reduce uncertainty and ambiguity, you'll have very rigid codes of belief and behavior, and very intolerant of anything that would be unorthodox. A weak uncertainty avoidance index, or weak UAI, culturally maintain more relaxed attitude in which practice counts more than principles. So they're just more open, whatever happens. It's more about the experience rather than having these sort of rigid moral codes. So, next is the long-term orientation versus short-term orientation dimension. So every society is trying to figure out how do you connect the past with the challenges of the present and the future. And cultures will prioritize these goals of what's happening now, what's happening in the future differently. So cultures who score low on this dimension prefer a time-honored, this is the long-term orientation, they prefer time-honored traditions and norms, and they view change with suspicion. So they're more of a long-term orientation. They're going to look at time-honored traditions, view change with suspicion. And those with a culture who score high, the short-term orientation, are going to take a more pragmatic approach. They're going to encourage thrift and efforts in modern and education as a way to prepare for the future. So again, I'm going to take a more pragmatic approach, encourage thrift and efforts in modern education, and prepare for the future. And then finally is the indulgence versus restraint continuum. Indulgence stands for a culture that allows for relatively free gratification of basic and natural human drives, just trying to enjoy life and have fun, right? So that they're more the indulgent side of the dimension. And then restraint is more about cultures that suppress gratification of needs and regulated by strict norms. So they're going to have more of a rigid code of morals and behavior. So indulgence versus restraint. So thinking about how to have these difficult conversations, especially around intersectionality, where it's highly complex. I think it's really important to think about like whether the values that come from your culture as a way of thinking about overcoming challenges or conflict that emerge in one's cultural point of view.